Okay, I'm Barbara Mittler. I'm from Heidelberg University, and they are director of the Center for Asian and Transcultural Studies. I'm originally a sinologist, so I work on China, but in a global context.
So in this podcast, we want to ask academics about their own trajectory. At the same time, how they decided to go into this line of job. You know, it's a weird kind of work to go into academia, and also how they decided to work on the questions on which they worked. And we want to kind of draw advice for younger researchers or people who are interested in this job. So can you tell me first about how you decided to go into academia?
Since I'm from Germany, it's a very hard decision to actually go into academia, and nobody from the beginning sort of knows that they are going to do this, because there is not just the doctoral thesis, but also a habilitation thesis that you have to pass before you are even eligible for any professorial positions. So it's not as if someone goes into academia and from the first day knows I'm going to be a professor. Usually there's also, especially in sinology, there's a lot of options of going, for example, into jobs in the economy, or jobs in the education, or jobs in the museum sector, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of possibilities of doing something else after the doctorate. So the doctorate doesn't necessarily lead into a university career. Why did I choose it? I didn't actually choose it. It also came by chance. I was originally wanting to become a musician, so something completely different. My mother is a musician, and that was sort of the field that I was very interested in. I played the piano and the violin, and somehow I then got into this international school in Canada for 2 years, learned Chinese there, and that sort of set me onto the China trip. And then I came to Heidelberg, first to Oxford, then to Heidelberg, and was just trying to come back to my music education, wrote a dissertation on Chinese music. That doesn't give you a professorship in Germany in Chinese studies, to be sure, because music is something very marginal in the field of China studies, and therefore I never thought of becoming an academic, but I was really keen on teaching the things that I had learned, and I also I had a very good supervisor who pushed me. And in a way, I mean, I think in the academic system, you do need the patron on the other side, the supervisor who pushes you, who advises you, who sort of says, this is a possible road that you can go, and who also says this is not a possible road to go. So I have quite a lot of students, actually, and I disadvise doing a habilitation in most cases, and I only advise in very, very few cases. In fact, I have myself have only habilitated one person so far, because it is a very tough career, to be sure. It's also very fun, and this is, I think, the reason why I sort of stuck with it, was because it opens a lot of freedom. You can structure your day in the way you want, but it also means that you cannot, I mean, your life is not like the life like everyone's life. Weekends are not weekends. Weekends are worked through. Nights are not nights. You just, but it's also because you like the work that you do, right? Yeah. This is not so true anymore once you have become a full professor, because then you are actually involved in so much administrative work that you no longer can structure your day the way that you want. You need a sabbatical year to be able to do your research. Otherwise, it sort of ends up just being done on weekends and nights and so on and so forth.
And so your PhD was on Chinese music, and so it was a very personal subject, or?
Yes, it was kind of bringing the two loves of my life together in a way. So it was China and it was music. And
so can you tell me a little about this experience, the dissertation experience, because it's usually a huge thing, right?
Yes, I know. Yeah, a dissertation is a huge thing, and this was not so easy. So I was in Oxford for my undergrad and also for the MA, and then I came back. I was trying to find a supervisor for my PhD. I applied for some scholarship programs also in England, and the supervisors I could have had in Oxford were all interested in traditional Chinese music, but I had met someone who had this huge collection of contemporary Chinese music from Taiwan, from the People's Republic of China, and from Hong Kong. And I was really keen on working on this collection because nobody had done that before. And so that's how I sort of ended up in Heidelberg, because there was this supervisor of mine who really is a very open person, who's interested in music, who knows nothing about it. And he said, okay, you have to go to the musicology professor as your second supervisor, but then you can do it. And so I did it, and that's, if you do something in your dissertation that really nobody has done before, it means that you're very much on your own. A lot of PhD students now are doing their PhDs in groups, which is a nice experience because you're not so lonely. On the other hand, PhDs are expected to do something really groundbreaking, really new, basically becoming the founder of a school. And with this music project, that certainly was the case. And so in spite of the fact that, as I said earlier, it was a marginal topic, I was the one who wrote the first book on this in English, and everybody basically had to sort of follow and speak against me or speak for me, or afterwards, which was nice. That also meant for many years, even now, people ask me to write things on this topic, which is
it is nice.
It's a long time ago.
And so, what did you learn on a personal level from the PhD experience?
The PhD experience for me is a long time ago, and what I learned from it, and also then later from the habilitation, from writing a second book, is like writing books is really, really difficult, and the fun of writing books is doing all the reading and finding all the materials beforehand, and doing in my case, doing interviews with the composers, and so a real danger in writing in the process of producing a dissertation is that you spend a lot of time gathering materials, and you never get to the point when you actually write about the materials. And this is really dangerous, because it means that you're amassing so much that in the end you cannot really handle it anymore. So that's also the advice I give to my students today, is that really, there must be a point when you just decide to stop and you write that dissertation, because otherwise you could go on for ever. Exactly.
It's a question. I'm just curious, how do you shift from music to images, which has been the main theme, the main thread of your research for
many years now? Yeah. So I shifted because I really had to shift. It was a marginal topic in my field, and so the next book I wrote was a book on the Shenbao, which is this Shanghai newspaper from the late 19th century. Originally I was going to do something in literature. I knew I wanted to do the 19th century, and there's still this completely unexplored field of translations that are not marked of literary works from Europe in Chinese. And I really wanted to do that detective work and find the original works, and that's because I'm also married to someone who's in literary studies. I was very interested. Now, no, I did that Shenbao book in the end because Heidelberg was already then a center specialized on collecting newspapers, especially historical newspapers, and the materials were there. It was really convenient, and it was a group of people of us working on the Shenbao. And so that book then was a book about the Shenbao as a text, the newspaper as a text. But then the newspaper as a text is a text that combines text and visuals and other such things. And I realized, that text can be film, can be music, can be text can be lots of other things, and visuals included. And this is when I started to also work on visuals.
Chinese language is visual.
And Chinese language, you can say is also visual. That's true, absolutely. And they play with it in the newspapers. I mean, a newspaper page, Chinese newspaper page is really very interesting in terms of visual attractions, because you can have writing in the 19th century and early 20th century, writing left to right, top to bottom, right to left, and in different fonts. And that's why it's so difficult to OCR Chinese newspapers, and to this point in time, everybody is retyping them because we cannot digitize them just like that. We cannot OCR them. So how did I get to visuals? It was through this newspaper project. I then started to evolve that also into a project on women's magazines, because one chapter in the newspaper book was on the female reader, the implied female reader. And then I started, there with women's magazines, there's a lot of visuals. Also because the implied reader is someone who doesn't read so well. That led to illustrated magazines, that led also to advertising. I mean, the beginning of that implied reader chapter in the newspaper book is on advertisements, where you could clearly see that the advertisements over time are directed no longer to the male reader of the newspaper, but to a female consumer. And so, that's how images came in. And I really, started to, I've come back to music. I'm now writing a book on the contemporary music scene, but from a different perspective, from a global perspective. And this is something we really need to talk about, how from a sinologist who speaks about a Chinese newspaper and the Chineseness of contemporary music, how that person comes to speak about China in a global context. I'm now working on a book where I look at the fate of the Chinese musician on the global stage. And that is the Chinese musician who plays the piano and the violin. And, these instruments that are supposedly European instruments, but have already, a history of 150 years or so in improv practice in China. And therefore, I would say are Chinese instruments just as well, right?
Yeah, so can you tell us about this transition?
So the transition, I've worked on music, which was sort of music in basically contemporary styles in China in my first book. Then I worked on a newspaper which was actually introduced or produced by a Scottish businessman who came to Shanghai, who then instigated this newspaper in Chinese. And it's called A Newspaper for China, and I really look at how sort of the editorial as a normal form, a regular form in a newspaper in the West, how that is translated into a bagwen, an examination essay in the Chinese case. What news means if you produce it for a Chinese reader, and so on and so forth. The question was always, how does that translate into China? Because I was a sinologist, I was defining myself by the region that I was studying. But I was always working on forms that had somehow traveled from one place to another. And then we started to work on this big cluster of excellence application, and there it was Asia and Europe in a global context. And I started to realize that what I had always been working on was how China was situated in the world. And that's, how now, I always don't define my questions from the question of how Chinese is it, but from how does it situate itself in the global context.
Yeah, it's interesting in general to you can have a back perspective on your research and see common threads that you didn't see before. Exactly. It's very interesting to look back and say, oh, okay, this is what I was interested in too, actually.
That's why the the HDR in the French system is so good, because what you do with the habilitation, in German you write a second book that cannot have anything to do with your first book. So you have to really write a totally different thing. But in France you have to show what your life trajectory, your academic trajectory was, and that's part of your HDR. And I think that's a very good way of actually reckoning what you have done and why you have done it.
Because sometimes there is coherence and sometimes it's less obvious.
It depends. Trying to make sense of a treasury. Back to it.
Yeah, but even if there seems to be incoherence, I think a lot of the times also the paths not taken or the paths that seemingly take you away from something later make you able to see something that you haven't seen earlier. And I think, therefore, an academic life is never straightforward.
No, of course. And it's still long you gaps. Who has done all that research, so there must still be something in common, whatever.
Yes, and academic lives, I'm not sure in France, but certainly in Germany there are long gaps when you don't really have a secure job, for example, and when you really have to constantly reinvent yourself, and what are the options that I could take, and therefore, if I've done a marginal topic, maybe I want to move into something that's more central, like newspapers and so on and so forth, and this is
short-term strategy that you might take before
but
the
even
next jobs you will apply,
exactly.
but still you're trying to maximize with what you are able to do.
And you do also want to serve your own interests.
And so more general way, apart from saying it is tough, what are other like general advice you would go?
Okay.
It is good advice. It is good advice because some students like have no idea how academic work is competitive, how competitive it is. So it is very good advice to tell them, be careful, it's very competitive. And apart from that, what are the general advices you give to students who are interested in academia?
I didn't mean to really say it's so tough, don't do it. I just mean to say that if you are thinking about it, think about it twice or three times, because it really means that you have to write all the time. And you cannot just gather material, you really have to produce books. And for some people, writing is really difficult. Actually, for all of us, writing is really difficult. I always leave it to the last moment. I always write my conference papers the night before the conference. Then they are finished, right? And I know that I really have to finish it now, and then I finish it. And a lot of people have that problem, that it really is hard to write. And so if you cannot stand that, don't even think of becoming an academic. Second thing is, you're constantly under peer pressure. That is, your peers are watching what you're doing, your peers are criticizing what you're doing, and you cannot get ahead because of peer review, for example, unless you can take it that someone is going to basically tear you apart. So you're also constantly, no academic that I know has a good self-confidence, because they're constantly under survey and constantly questioned by other people of whether or not what you're doing is actually worth doing. And so this
and the criticism can be very
harsh.
Very harsh.
And because we love what we do, it's existential.
Because most of the time it's done, at a distance. Like, since you're not seeing the people you are criticizing, people in writing can be very harsh. They wouldn't say that to your face in a conference, but in a peer review, it can be the anonymous part of it. The anonymous part of it, and I think it makes it easier to be less empathetic.
Absolutely. I mean, even with open peer review, for example, which is not anonymous, sometimes you can get this kind of situation. So. I think it's
to make enemies.
No,
but sometimes it can be good also to have some, remarks you didn't expect.
Absolutely.
Make you think about things you didn't.
Yes, but you have to start. You have to develop a thick skin. Right? So just so that you don't feel offended by the kinds of questions, but actually take those questions as a stepping board to do something with it. And this is a really tough part, because usually when you're a young researcher, you take these things to heart and you take them like negatively. And that also needs to, so you have to have enough self-confidence to be always questioned. And that,
Yes, those are very, very good advices, I think.
But on the other hand, being an academic means you can really do what is interesting to you. And so, it's one of the most wonderful jobs you can have. You can have a family while you're being an academic very easily, because you can work from home. And so for anybody who wants to have a family, this is a wonderful job. But it means that you might have to wait for a steady position for a long time. It means that you're in projects and precarious positions for long times of your life.
Organize your time.
And you need to sort of have, I guess, also some kind of self-discipline, right? Because there's nobody telling you have to write 2 articles this month, but you have to
be able to navigate in a pretty unstructured environment.
Right, exactly. It's totally unstructured.
Compared to most jobs.
Which is the beauty of it, because you can decide to take Friday off completely. You know that you will then work Saturday and Sunday for it, but this is totally free.
But if you want to take a vacation on Thursday, you can.
You can. Thursday, even Monday, whatever. I mean, any day of the week, but then you have to somehow.
Mine are Thursdays as well.